This is the Ukraine banner that Promoting Enduring Peace prepared for the Rally for Ukraine in Hartford.
We had this Atlanta Police Foundation, which now took control and responsibility for the training of the Atlanta police force, because they would be the leasers and the owners of the police foundation, the police training center that was being built. Now, this is important because this is the first time that we will have here a private corporation doing training for a public police force.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to the Struggle Video News. This is the Ukraine banner that Promoting Enduring Peace prepared for the Rally for Ukraine in Hartford at 1:30 on Sunday, the 23rd. The rally marks the start of the 4th year of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As you know, Trump is ready to throw Ukraine under the bus. But Biden was not so great either. This may come as a shock, as the U.S. sent Ukraine over $100 billion for weapons. But remember, the U.S. empire looks out for the interests of the U.S. billionaires at all times. Most of the money taken from U.S. taxpayers went to pay the owners of the U.S. weapons companies. But there's more. 1. Biden said nothing, while India's imports of Russian oil went from practically zero to 1.58 million barrels of oil a day. 2. He didn't stop imports of Russian uranium. 3. He never worked to cancel Ukraine's debts to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. 4. He didn't try to stop Russia's shadow fleet of ships from delivering products around the world. And 5, by demanding that Ukraine get behind Israel's crimes, he cut off support from millions of people around the world, and those countries kept buying Russian goods. Biden's half-hearted support in the face of invasion and genocide was a recipe of slow defeat, which hopefully can be reversed. Here's Steve Bannon, a former Trump strategist, speaking at the influential Conservative Political Action Conference.
The only way that they win is we retreat, and we're not going to retreat. We're not going to surrender. We're not going to quit. Fight, fight, fight. Amen.
He gives an absolutely clear Nazi salute. We checked the ADL Twitter page on February 21st for a comment. Remember, this is the outfit supposedly protecting American Jews from anti-Semitism. This is the outfit whose executive director said Musk's salutes were merely an awkward gesture. What did the ADL say about Steve Bannon's Nazi salute? Well, it criticizes Bannon kind of cryptically. It doesn't mention the Nazi salute at all. No doubt to not remind its minions how the ADL justified Musk's awkward gesture. They linked to an article they wrote about Bannon 9 years ago. If you don't read other sources, you'd have no idea what the ADL was talking about. Then the ADL goes on with 10 or 15 tweets about Israel. And on their website, nothing at all about Nazi salutes. I wrote about the failure of the whole Jewish establishment to condemn Musk on the site New Politics. The best way to get to it is via the Archive Against Fascism on the site of Promoting Enduring Peace. To Germany. Our viewers know about the rise of the far-right party AfD in Germany. But what's not known is how much the main parties of Germany have taken on their hateful views. We'll go to a part of an interview done on Democracy Now! On February 14.
I said that you worked for a lawyer working for the German Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Can you talk about the pressure you've been under and what's happened?
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, Amy. Thank you for giving us space to speak here. I think the situation in Germany at the moment is really dire. There is a blatant attack on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. We see a dismantling of the rule of law in Germany at the moment, a crisis of democracy, and we really very much fear the upcoming elections in 10 days. And we actually think that this might be the last election before fascism, because the center parties, especially the Social Democrats, the Green Party, also the Left Party, they have taken over the rhetoric of the far right, and not just the rhetoric, but also the policies. So they have made 2 new resolutions against freedom of speech. They have banned Francesca Albanese from speaking at universities this and next week, the politicians. So they have done a crackdown on the protests and anti-war movement, anti-genocide violence movement. Last week, it was banned to talk any language except English and German, and that was due to lies spread by Axel Springer, the biggest right-wing newspaper in Germany that is constantly going after people, doxing people. So anyone basically who speaks out in Germany at the moment against the Israeli war crimes against the government is being subjected to political repression and also private and political doxing, where people lose their jobs. But when on the other side you can express genocidal rhetoric without fearing any consequences.
Now the German election is only a few days away. The far-right AfD is expected to make a very strong showing. It's a party careful not to say anything openly against Jews, but its leaders have repeatedly said that all the commemoration of Nazi barbarities against Jews is a mistake or a disgrace. Wink, wink. Until now, none of the other German parties will join with it openly. But Musk has given it tremendous support, and recall that U.S. Vice President Vance has specifically called for an end to the German firewall against working with the ultra-right. This is a tweet from the official White House account. Is Trump setting up a monarchy? You recall his tendency to make a supposed joke and then to see if there's any real opposition. There are rallies springing up all across the U.S. against the chaotic, unjustified mass layoffs. This was one in Peekskill, New York, outside of Senator Schumer's office. In January, Promoting Enduring Peace held an online forum to discuss the Stop Cop City movement. It was held on the anniversary of the police killing of Tortuguita. One of the speakers was Kamau Franklin.
So we're going to be talking to Kamau and Abundia, who've been on the front line of that resistance struggle since day one, and who are going to be talking about not just what is going on currently in Atlanta and the lessons that have been learned from that and what we can take from that moving forward, because this is not just a single battle, but actually part of a much bigger plan to build these cop cities all over the United States, or I could say US occupied Turtle Island. So we're holding this today, January 18th, because it is exactly 2 years after the police murder of the indigenous trans forest defender Tortuguita, who died while trying to defend Weelaunee Forest from being bulldozed to create this cop city. And we're going to be speaking first to Kamau Franklin. So Kamau Franklin is the founder of Community Movement Builders, and he has been a dedicated community organizer for over 30 years, starting in New York City and now based in Atlanta. And of course, Community Movement Builders and Kamau have been really on the front lines of this struggle right from day one. So Kamau, I am going to hand it over to you, and thank you so, so much for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And today so far has already been a busy day, as I spoke about earlier before we came on air. I just came from a rally and demonstration that was not only in honor of Tortuguita, this being again, as you mentioned, the second anniversary of their murder, but one that is still pressing and fighting, not only to stop Cop City from being built, but again, connecting all the different international issues together to let folks understand, or to help make folks understand that Cop City, in and of itself, is this one symptomatic part of a larger issue of empire building, and police and military control over populations, resources, and land. And I feel like we always have to keep that in mind, that this is not just a struggle around people's rights. This is a land struggle. This is a struggle around people actually living. And this is also a struggle around resources being usurped, causing climate damage, and that people have to understand that these issues are connected, and that empire around the world is connected in terms of how it handles these issues. And so I'll go back to start off with, just to give people a quick understanding of how we came to start battling against Cop City, so that everybody can be just on the same page. After the 2020 uprisings, when George Floyd was murdered, Breonna Taylor was murdered, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta was murdered, there was uprisings, obviously, across the country. And we have to remember that this was actually during the COVID time period. And so people actually started to come out their house, out their shelters during a time period of COVID, because the expression of I guess, anger was so great, that the system, even during this time period, continually found ways to kill Black people, and continually found ways to get the over-policing of Black folks. And while the larger community was shouting for abolishing the police, defunding the police, finding alternatives to the police, Atlanta instead decided to go the opposite way, which was to find a way in which to build, at the time, the second largest proposed militarized police training center in the country. And when we say second largest, we're talking about something that was upwards of cutting down over 100 acres of forest in order to build a training center that included, at the time at least, Black Hawk helicopters, mock city for urban warfare training and crowd control, mock bars, hotels, housing, kennels for training of dogs, in terms of sticking them on people in crowds, around 12 different firing ranges at the time. So all of these things were being proposed in its original iteration. And we as organizers and activists immediately saw this as a response to the movements and the uprisings that had happened, not only in 2020, but going all the way back to 2012, right? Going all the way back to Mike Brown being killed, all the way back to when Trayvon Martin was killed, that these uprisings were taking place across the country at different intervals for the last 10 or 15 years at that point. And the state decided that as opposed to listening to the demands of the people and to stop killing, over arresting, murdering people, that it felt it had lost control of the streets. And the building of Cop City was around controlling movements and stopping mass marches and demonstrations, as well as the idea of continuing to have a police force, a militarized force, which could continue to over-police not only Black communities, but poor communities, immigrant communities, working class communities. And this was their sort of doubling down on a particular type of warfare that they had already been engaged in. And as we know, this warfare was not local to Atlanta. The Atlanta police, for decades, had received training from the IDF and from Israeli police commanders and police forces. The Atlanta police had continually made visits, as well as the Israeli police and IDF making visits here to Atlanta. In fact, Atlanta is known as the most surveilled city outside of 5 cities in China. So it is the most surveilled city in the world outside of 5 cities in China. And so where did Atlanta get the idea of the surveillance technology? The commanders themselves said from a trip to Jerusalem, where they saw the ways in which the surveillance system worked against Palestinians, that they needed something like that over here, over in the United States, over particularly in Atlanta. And they set up a system of cameras, both private and public, which is always extremely important in terms of how things done when you mix capitalist enterprises with public politicians who work for billionaire bosses. And so public and private cameras went up and were connected, making Atlanta the most surveilled city in the world outside of 5 cities in China. Um, and so this over-policing continued, and they decided to put this in what we've dubbed as Walani Forest, right? So a forest a little bit outside of Atlanta, but that's owned by the city of Atlanta, like within a community where that forest was promised to be preserved, to be used for walking trails, bike trails, parks, a place for the community, which was a 70% Black and working class community. All these plans were on the table. And the moment they decided to do Cop City, they scrapped all of these plans and decided instead of doing that, that they were going to tear down 100 acres of forest to build Cop City. Um, Again, when we saw this, we immediately understood that this was an attempt to stifle our movements. In addition, we know that, as stated earlier, when the call was the abolition of police and the defunding of police, not that they necessarily truly expected this to happen, but the powers that be, the corporations, the public interest, decided that they wanted additional avenues of resources for the police just in case some city reduced the budget by 3% or 5% or 2%. And so I won't call it the birth of, but the reorganization and the uh, putting these police foundations at the center point of additional funding sources for the police. And so you had these sleepy police foundations, which never took in a lot of money across the country. Some of them were no bigger than $200,000 or $300,000 organizations. Immediately post 2020, these organizations became cash cows for private corporations. The same private corporations that were shouting that Black Lives Matter were now instantly putting money, millions of dollars, into the building of cop cities through police foundations. In Atlanta, which has no bigger than the 20th biggest policing agency in the country, has the second largest police foundation in the country. And so millions of dollars were put into the Atlanta Police Foundation. And in addition to that, we had this Atlanta Police Foundation, which now took control and responsibility for the training of the Atlanta police force because they would be the leasers and the owners of the police foundation, I mean, the police training center that was being built. Now, this is important because this is the first time that we will have here a private corporation doing training for a public police force, in charge of the training for a public police force. So again, millions of dollars have been poured into these agencies so that they can now take on the responsibility of having an extra added revenue source for the police. Most states have now, both conservative and so-called liberal states, have now decided to put caps on cities reducing their police budgets, right? And so if a city even got the bad idea that it wanted to spend its resources in other places, the state, which has constitutional rights and protections that cities do not have enacted laws that says the city can only reduce a police budget by a certain amount, if that at all. And if it does anything to do more than that, its actual charter can be in jeopardy, and or the state can take over the city. So these are some of the things in which the the city and the states have done to attempt to reinforce and or make sure that their police forces are as invigorated as possible when it comes to battling our communities, and when it comes to over policing, and when it comes to stopping our movements. And this is not just a right wing or Republican problem. This is both neoliberals and or Democrats and right-wing Republicans, right? This is both overt white supremacists and what I would call covert white supremacists. And it doesn't matter what color they are. So here in Atlanta, which builds itself as the Black Mecca, a Black-led city, a Black police, I mean, a Black mayor has taken the lead. And in fact, a Black mayor and a queer police captain have taken the lead in building out the Cop City enterprise and in criminalizing those fighting against it. In fact, the mayor, the so-called liberal Black mayor, has teamed with the right-wing white Republican governor to do everything possible to stop the Cop City organizers and activists from challenging them on stopping Cop City. Now, this battle has gone on for over 3 years at this particular stage. And actually, we're now in 2025 coming upon the fourth year of this battle. And we as organizers and activists have done everything that we think is possible to organize against this center being built. And the state and the city have used every means at its disposal to punish organizers and activists for attempting to stop this from being built. And we've, since its very beginning, we've done when the Cop City uprisings first started, when the Cop City actions first started, they were what, anybody who's done organizing, they were very standard organizing techniques. There were town hall meetings, there were public speak outs, there was marches, there was demonstrations. Even during that time period, we were met with violence. We had some of our demonstrations broke up. We had people who were arrested, charged with obstruction of governmental administration, resisting arrest. So even those early periods were met with police misconduct and police brutality of a certain level that, to be honest, we were used to, right? But still, it's important to note that even at its earliest iterations, the Stop Cop City movement was targeted and criminalized. As the movement gained strength, and particularly as the movement turned to a forest defending strategy, at least parts of the movement turned to a forest defending strategy after the city council had passed the resolution allowing the city to lease the land to the Atlanta Police Foundation. This strategy of civil disobedience and direct action basically projected the movement nationally to a certain degree. And the city then entered into basically a coalition, a task force with the county, the county police of DeKalb County, The Georgia state troopers, but the federal government, the FBI, and Homeland Security. This task force decided that they would start bringing domestic terrorism charges because some of the actions, which we don't consider violent, were about stopping the very machinery which was going to tear down the forest. And as we would get talked to by the media, they said, "Isn't this violence?" We said, "This is not violence. Violence is the everyday killing of our people, over arresting of our people, the long prison sentences that our people have. That is violence. Stopping a machine from operating, no one is being hurt. That is not violence. But the police and the media and the governor and the mayor all decided to do this task force. And then they began 2 years ago to this day, making raids into the forest, one prior to this day. And on this day was the raid in which Tortuguita was murdered in the forest, sitting in a tent, crisscross, hands raised, protecting their face. Tortuguita was shot at least over 50 times, with multiple bullet wounds throughout their body. Since then, the city and the state have tried to destroy their image, tried to paint him as some sort of Rambo figure who was throwing concussion grenades and so forth. But all the evidence that's been gathered shows that Tortuguita was shot with their hands up, with their palms out, and sitting crisscross in a cloth tent as they were surrounded by policing agencies from the various forces I mentioned earlier. Their family, I'm sorry, is now suing with a civil lawsuit against the Georgia state troopers as well as the city of Atlanta for wrongful death. And Tortuguita has become the symbol of that movement. After domestic terrorism charges, the state then moved on to RICO charges, racketeering charges. Those racketeering charges still 61 people in which they're claiming the movement is a conspiracy. And what's very interesting about their idea of a conspiracy is that in the indictment against the organizers and activists, what they've done is said the conspiracy started the day that George Floyd was murdered, not the day we started organizing against Cop City. For them, the conspiracy started when people came out of their homes and houses into the streets to organize against police violence. That is when they consider the conspiracy to have taken place. And so since then, they've randomly, and I should say this, make this clear, the people arrested both for domestic terrorism charges and RICO charges are not necessarily people who've been quote unquote leaders of the movement. They are people who came to a dance party, people who came to go into the forest, people who came to demonstrations. These are people who, when the police will look at their IDs, if their ID had was a Georgia ID, they would let them go. If their IDs were from out of state, they would arrest them. And why did they do this? Because their narrative was that the crux of the Stop Cop City movement were out-of-towners, white anarchists. Whereas the very truth of the matter is that from the very beginning, it was local organizers and activists, black, brown, white, grassroots organizers, definitely anarchists, people who considered themselves socialists, people who considered themselves just everyday people wanting to fight to save the environment. So it was a whole grouping of different people. But for their purposes, they wanted to create a narrative which said it was outside agitators. And they actually used that terminology. They used the terminology of classic white supremacists and or Jim Crow advocates from the 50s and 60s as a way of describing the organizers and activists today. And I'll start to wrap with this. You know, again, as I mentioned earlier, we knew at the very beginning that these issues are all tied to each other. And so when I talked about the fact that the IDF has done training with the Atlanta police, other Western nations have also done training together, police training, to have coherent coherent strategies and all-encompassing strategies on how they put down movements that are building in their different countries. And what we just saw over the last 18 months, basically the genocide of Palestinians, is a fulfillment of some of this strategy of doing whatever it takes to hurt, harm, stop, repress, and oppress people who are fighting for their liberation. Those tactics and strategies can very well be visited here as they've been visited on people in other lands. In fact, those tactics and strategies are mostly paid for, and those weapons are paid for by this government here, which are then taken over there. So we have to be completely clear that as we're going into this time period where overt fascism, overt white nationalism is re-entering the White House, they present some very real, distinct dangers. But we should always remember that those dangers have already been here and have been laid out for us, not just over the past 20 years, but over the past 400 years of this country's existence. That the idea of capital domination, the idea of controlling people and controlling people's lives, the idea of empire building, the idea of a government created by the rich and for the rich, an idea of making people subservient workers to the whim and will of that billionaire class is something that continues to this very day, and our struggle has to be against that. Cop City is a symptom. It is one battle. It is not the larger war. We have to remember that the larger war is against the empire. And during this time period, we have to continue to be vigilant, ready, and organize ourselves to fight back against this dilemma. So thank you very much for letting me speak to you for a few minutes.
We've learned that Francis Boyle has died. He was an attorney and a law school professor at the University of Illinois. He advised Bosnia successfully in its case against Serbia for the genocide against Bosnians in the 1990s. He had the guts to debate Bill O'Reilly just days after 9/11. He opposed the U.S. rush to war against Afghanistan. We know how great that war turned out. He was a man who stood up for Palestinian rights. He filed lawsuits against an Israeli general for the Sabra Shatila massacre. He called for BDS against Israeli institutions years before the Palestinian civil society movement. I interviewed him around 2011. Here's a bit of it as he talked about how he was slandered and kept from speaking at various universities.
I remember once lecturing at NYU Law School and about the Middle East peace process, the creation of the Palestinian state. And the whole faculty and student body just beat the hell out of me for 2 hours, 3 hours about being an anti-Semite and this, that, and the other thing. And then they wouldn't publish my paper in the proceedings. And then they try to stiff me on my expenses. And this is typical. So I don't go anywhere anymore unless I get my expenses up front. I don't care who they are. Well, that's clear. If you even criticize Israel, yes, you're accused of being anti-Semitic, despite the fact that large numbers of people in Israel probably agree with what you're saying. Sure. I remember interviewing at Northwestern Law School up in Chicago for a job. And I gave a scholarly paper criticizing the Israeli raid at Entebbe for violating different norms of international law. It was just a very scholarly presentation and saying I didn't think this was a very healthy precedent. And it got back to me. I was rejected for being anti-Semitic. So any criticism at all of Israel for any reason is deemed to be anti-Semitic. Now, that's just experiences at Northwestern, Yale, Harvard, NYU, 4 law schools there. I mean, I could go through more if you want. University of New Orleans, I was invited down there to speak, and the Jewish committee, even before I showed up, pressured the dean. It's supposed to be run by Jesuits. Pressured the dean, saying, you know, Boyle's an anti-Semite, and therefore you should cancel his lecture. Well, the dean refused to cancel the lecture outright, but what he did was cancel the funding at the last minute.
And we close with Debka at an event in Springfield, Massachusetts for the group We Will Return that aids Palestinians primarily in Gaza. Don't you wish you could dance like that? That's our program for today. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle Video News.